This is Season 2 of the MENA Talks podcast. The MENA Talks is a series by the BIC on the wider Middle East and Africa regions. Once a month, our hosts, along with special guests, will have a frank discussion on underlying historical, economic, social, and political drivers behind today's systemic issues. The BIC is present on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Follow us and subscribe to receive our latest news and publications.
I'm delighted to talk to Carlos Lopes, the renowned and much respected professor from the Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Professor Lopes is also visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris and associate fellow in the Africa program at Chatham House. He has occupied several leadership positions across the United Nations system, including Policy Director for Secretary General Kofi Annan and Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa. He is also the African Union's High Representative for Partnerships with Europe, and he's associated with a number of high-level boards, including the Global Commission for Economy and Climate. Professor Lopes, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, Shada.
Professor Lopes, you've often said that Africa is the future of the world. And I'm assuming you're referring to what we call the continent's youth dividend, the fact that Africa has the youngest population in the world. Are there other elements that we overlook when assessing Africa's future?
Thank you, Shada. I kind of laughed when the new president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, gave an interview in Marrakesh in the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank recently, and he said, Africa is the future of the world. I said, well, I must be reading my books. And in fact, there is more and more understanding of the demographic dimension of that equation, including a recent very important coverage done by the New York Times, for which I also contributed through the writer Declan Walsh. I think more than the demographics, we have to look into all megatrends. And when we do so, we realize that there is no solution for the world problems without Africa being part of it. For instance, you think of climate, Africa is the only continent that has a positive balance in terms of carbon. What we emit is less than what we capture. It is also where you have the best potential for renewables of the new generation, like green hydrogen, according to the International Energy Agency. It is also where you can find most of the critical minerals. It's not the only place where you find them, but it's a place where you can find a variety of minerals that are required for the transition, not just the climate one, but also some of the new technologies that require certain types of leagues of metals that Africa possesses in great quantity. And it's also, in terms of climate, where you have the largest blue economy potential. And more, we will have to look into the economy of the sea as an alternative in many respects. So there is no solution without Africa. Then you look into technology. Normally, people focus on innovation. And innovation is very much linked to intellectual property. And intellectual property is very much linked to patents registration. What you see is that the oldest population in the world, which is Japan, has a correlation that is quite significant between number of patents registered and the aging of its population. So the more older the population, the less patents registered. And it's pretty obvious that you would expect innovation to be very much linked to youthness and the characteristics of the population. So older populations in the future are going to live out of the intellectual property that they have accumulated or intellectual property that they will build by importing talent. And of course, this type of migration, the migration of talent, is going to be extremely important. Africa is already dominating in a number of creative industries, and this is just the beginning of a trend that is going to see more and more Africans involved in creativity, and talent is going to spread quite significantly. But then there is another dimension of this technological revolution, which is the more tech-intensive products and processes are going to be, the more appealing they will be to younger population and the more difficult they will be to absorb by older populations. So you can't really ignore the market that is going to have the largest potential for absorbing these technologies, and that is going to be the markets with the younger population. And that is going to be mostly India and Africa, because 1 in every 2 newborns by 2040 onwards is going to be African. So we cannot really ignore that market. So these are just complementary dimensions of demographics that cannot be overlooked. And that's why there is so much interest in Africa right now from a geopolitical point of view.
Professor, thank you very much indeed for that very, very important insight. Now, it seems to me that in the European Union, in Brussels, in Berlin, Paris, there seems to be a lack of awareness, I would put it moderately, about all of the things that you've actually talked about. Because the future here seems to be a focus on Africa for its raw materials. And we had German Chancellor Olaf Scholz giving a very good example of this. He was in Africa recently, and it was his third visit to Africa since taking office 2 years ago. And he was, once again, seeking to expand Germany's sourcing of vital raw materials. So this message of Africa as the future, creative, innovative, with a young population that is ready to take risks that aging Europe is no longer able to do, doesn't seem to have entered into the European mindset. They're still looking at Africa from a very old-fashioned point of view as access to raw materials.
It's only the latest installment of a trend. In the beginning of this century, we had this Africa Rising narrative that was also based on opportunities for business that Africa possesses that were not being taken into account, and therefore the investment community should look into the continent differently. And the moment there were some macroeconomic difficulties, mostly resulting from the impact of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, so not Africa's doing, but Africa suffering from an external exogenous shock, the narrative started to modify back to the old interpretation of comparative advantages. Comparative advantages theory has been responsible for a catastrophe in Africa because it has always been interpreted in its sort of static dimension, when in fact what counts in terms of competitiveness is how you use comparative advantages from a dynamic point of view. And dynamic point of view means that you can, out of nothing, out of scratch, build your comparative advantage. But if you are static, it's about what nature gives you, or what geography gives you, or what some intrinsic value that may exist gives you. It's really not moving, and that's where we are. Most of Africa continues to be trapped in a colonial model that is based on the comparative advantages theory interpretation of that time, and it has not changed. So the liberation of Africa from that colonial trap in economic terms is very much linked to the realization that we need to industrialize and we need to do structural transformation. When you say industrialization, it's not the old-fashioned industrial policy of the past, because this is just not possible. Now it's about embracing green and cleaner energy potential that Africa possesses. It's about making sure that we have transformation and value addition on a commodity-based industrialization that is going to position in relation to geopolitical tensions of the moment. Like critical minerals give Africa really an edge in terms of bargaining, the same way we have an edge in a number of other areas that have not been exercised by our leaders. So I wouldn't condemn Chancellor Scholz and other European leaders for just persisting on the same. I will first condemn the African leaders for not exercising enough their agency and not bargaining with the same tact that they have done actually with the Chinese. And we can elaborate on why I think with the Chinese, the Africans have been better negotiators. But the bottom line is this: Africa and Europe have a very emotional relationship, tainted by historical dimensions that don't exist with any other partner. And that characteristic counts for the way Europeans continue to look into Africa as a terrain where they need to support, they need to help, and they need to, sort of give aid. And in compensation, Africa has to do the right things in terms of governance. And this equation is completely out of sync with the reality, because the reality is that we are in a trap where those who give aid think they are helping, and those who receive aid think they are being helped. When in fact, the real equation that makes sense is for Africa to be able to claim that it should have access to capital, number one, that it should have better trade partnerships and regimes, and number three, that Africa should be capable of making its own policy choices. And in these three, the Europeans are not very keen on helping Africa. On access to capital, it's not a coincidence that Chinese lending has become overwhelming. It's because the Europeans are absent, not because the Chinese are putting a lot of money. In fact, they put about $10 billion of investment a year, which is the equivalent of what they do for Pakistan. But the Europeans are absent, so there is no access to capital. We are discussing debt right now, and the problem is that African countries cannot even now access these prohibitive interest rates that are practiced by commercial banks in Europe and other lenders in Europe. Even that they cannot access because of the risk perceptions. Second, on trade, unilateral decisions continue to fly. I was very militant in trying to ask the Europeans that the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, not be rolled out without taking into consideration the specificities of Africa, because it's going to penalize Africa big time. We can lose up to 1% of our GDP. That's more than all the aid that we are going to receive from the European Union. So, and it's something that is being decided unilaterally. So on this terrain, there is no help. And it's just one example. We can say the same about SAF, the new safe aviation fuel, and you go on with the list. And then the third is this issue about policy space, because now each time that there are promises and pledges being made, for instance, on climate finance, and that are not met, the response is to say, oh, but the Africans also need to improve their fiscal management, and they have to increase their fiscal pressure. So we are going to help them with tax without borders. We are going to help them with a number of mechanisms that will allow for their finances to be improved. The Africans should be very thankful for such help. But that is not a replacement for the pledges and commitments made, and it's being used as such. So you can see that in balance, all these promises become a bit futile and paradoxical, because people think they are being helped, and those who help think they are helping. But in fact, what really helps that we need is in the three domains that I just mentioned.
Professor, thank you for that. And I'm just sort of thinking at the moment, the ideas that have sort of infested our relationship for so long. The European Union has been trying with the African Union, with African countries, to try and thrash out an equal partnership, a partnership of equals. And some of the questions that you've raised about access to finance, these unilateral decision-making, giving Africa policy space, they could be brought into this conversation. And I'm just wondering, have they been brought into this conversation, or are we still sort of talking to each other, as you said, with a colonial model, a colonial mindset?
It's very much one of, we support you with aid, therefore let's discuss what are the conditions for this aid to be delivered. And, it enters into the political realm, it enters into the security realm, and then there is the counter measures that are expected from Africa. At the end of the day, are mostly about migration. And it's not said, but that's what is implicit. And there is more and more this tendency of doing cash for control deals. They started in Niger, and they're just proliferating all over. And I think this is very much perceived by the Africans as sort of a model that is discriminatory and that is stigmatizing the Africans. Because if you look into the Frontex numbers, the Africans that are entering the European Union are mostly legal entries. So it's about over 90%. So it's a very minimal number of illegal. But, that's not the public perception in Europe. It's the opposite. If you ask an European who are the most important contingents of migrants entering the Union, they will immediately mention 3 or 4 African names. But in fact, the Africans are very absent from the top 10 contingents. There is only one African country in that number. So if you tell them that the number 1 contingent is actually from Russia, they will be quite surprised. That's the reality. So there is this gap. And this gap is manifested also in the way Europeans and Africans are negotiating. The Africans are insisting, African Union, that we need to have a continent-to-continent relationship in 4 areas. And they have identified very clearly. So I was part of that process. So it's peace and security, it's migration, climate change, and trade. Those are the 4 areas where we should negotiate continent to continent. All the rest can be, bilateral with countries and so on. Why these 4? Because they are structural. And they can't be the subject of different tracks and different arrangements. Like in the case of trade, we have 13 agreements with the European Union. That divides completely Africa and does not allow our continental free trade area to progress. Mm. On climate, it's the same. I just gave the example of CBAM and SAF. But, this is the kind of things that it's very hard to make the European Union accept to negotiate as one with Africa. They always go with the Africans that are ready to play ball. And it's very easy to entice African leaders, not all of them, but a few of them, to be in all kinds of conferences and meetings and summits and so on. And then here you go. You legitimize your African sort of openness and position because you have a few Africans that are there. And you always pick the ones that are ready to accept what you are going to propose. And you ignore the rest.
But that's the point I wanted to talk to you about, Professor Lopes, because we're looking at the European Union and we're very clear-eyed about the mistakes that we're making here in Europe, thanks to people like yourself. But there's agency in Africa. These leaders have power. They are, they're in charge of the decisions they make. So often I hear a pushback from colleagues here where they say, but the problem doesn't lie just in Europe. The problem lies in Africa as well. Why are these leaders accepting cash for dirty deals on migrants? Why are they accepting European aid if it's so unwelcome? So just to turn the table a little bit, the responsibility of African leaders who do accept this dirty money, if you like, to control migration and other areas. What's your opinion on that?
That's why I started by saying, first I like to criticize the African leaders because I think, the issue of agency starts at home. If the African leaders are ready to transact in this manner, they basically, are undermining the possibilities of a different type of engagement. And that's why I think, they have been quite different with China because they don't have the same history with the Chinese. The Chinese are very transactional. And the Africans use that sort of Chinese attitude of being very transactional to be a bit more forthcoming in what they want. And they have sort of a difficulty in doing that with the Europeans because with Europe, the relationship is very emotional. It's very important that, a leader of a Francophone country be perceived as having proximity with the Francophone world and Paris in particular. The same with the UK and so on. So you have that sort of trap that is very difficult to overcome. In Europe, it's presented as assets. Country X and Y, because we have been colonial powers, we know Africa. So it's an asset in relation to the rest of the community. And therefore, they kind of have a subsidiarity. A lot of things that relate to Lusophone countries will be given to Portugal to take the lead. This attitude in Europe. And of course, Africans are actually responsible for letting this become perennial. And the likes of me, we are denouncing it and making sure that the relationship is going to be long lasting. And it's actually has the potential to be beneficial for both sides to do the right things. And some of these dimensions that I'm criticizing is not because I don't like Europe. It's the opposite. It's because I think that Europe and Africa are really to be together in a number of fronts internationally. But they can only do it if it is a serious engagement and not one that is basically undermining the possibilities for Africa to do structural transformation.
Just very quick question. Is the younger generation in Africa, is it less entangled in this colonial kind of relationship that you've talked about between African leaders of a certain generation and European Union leaders? Is there African youth, for instance, wouldn't have this colonial legacy hanging over it, would it?
I would say the African and the European youth. I think the youth in general are not really very keen on maintaining this type of, I would say, manipulative and very entangled diplomatic relationship. They are much more open because they have access to information that is not, unfortunately, often filtered and processed. But as raw as it is, it gives them a sense of priorities. And their sense of priorities for the younger generation is climate. It's also in Africa because, if you ask the African youth about what their difficulties are, they will say, of course, employment and a number of other social related consequences of the current economic situation as a priority, but they will link it to climate more and more. So it's becoming obvious that extreme weather and other phenomena, but also the way they see the impact of some of the unilateral measures on trade and so on. Those who understand that level of complexity, they understand it's all linked to climate. So there is, and the ones that are claiming what we like to call resource nationalism, they see it also really related to climate. So I would say the future is going to be probably brighter because the youth is not very much convinced that the type of engagement that we had so far has been successful.
So there's a commonality there between African youth and European youth. Absolutely. You've mentioned, Professor Lopes, you've mentioned China several times. And of course, China is on everyone's mind when we look at the world, the geopolitical chessboard, if you like. And there's a lot of talk here in Brussels, where I'm based, about China's growing presence in Africa. And, you've heard EU countries warning in all kinds of different fora that countries in Africa which accept Chinese financing are falling into a so-called debt trap. You said the Chinese have a transactional relationship with Africa, and that is perhaps more productive, more mutually beneficial than our relationship with Africa. So just explain a little bit your approach on how to, on Africa's relationship with China.
For me, just looking into economic history, there is no country really that has been able to develop without access to capital because of savings that have been accumulated in different ways that, can go all the way to the Middle Ages, how savings were constructed and so on. But the bottom line is that there are no countries that have been developed without access to capital. Africans, if you just look at the numbers, Africans have the least access to capital, not only today, but historically. So you don't expect countries really to develop without that access to capital. So if we need capital and, the normal sort of average that you would expect for an economy to be properly funded for development purposes, no less than 10% of GDP. And Africa is about 1% of GDP in terms of access to capital. If you look into this situation, you will say, okay, the ones that are going to be the most loved by the Africans are the ones that bring capital. So, and until now, Africa was basically pushed into the category of let's give them concessional lending. But let's look into that front. Is at a whole-time record right now that we never lended as much concessionally to Africa as we do today. However, what people forget is that the economies of the continent had doubled in size. The GDP of Africa in 2023 is twice what it was in the 90s of the last century. As concessionality availability also doubled in size? No, it's an all-time record, but not double. So therefore, in percentage terms, the funding of these economies through concessionality is going down, not up. So they have to look into alternatives. And what are the alternatives? There are two alternatives. One is commercial lending. And the commercial lending, it's basically prohibitive for Africa. We pay more than anybody else. There is a premium. It's called the Africa Risk Premium. It can be all the way to 5% more than the rest of the world. Sometimes, even with that kind of premium, you cannot access capital. And then you have the Chinese and the middle powers that have placed themselves in the middle. So they don't practice concessionality, but they also don't practice these prohibitive commercial interest rates. So instead of going for the 7-8%, they will go for the 3 or 4%. And these are the ones being condemned by Europe. Well, the solution is very simple. Just find the money in Europe that competes with this type of proposal. And this is not available. There's a lot, the moment we talk about how to do something about Africa, you hear two words immediately. One is de-risking. And the second word that you hear is that we need to increase investment opportunities. And basically, from Africa, the Africa Compact, all these different proposals. By the way, I did a study about the number of proposals that Europe and the European Union have done for Africa in the last 15 years. It's counting 23 already. So, and, this does not translate into the access to capital at 3-4%. It's very pragmatic. The moment that will be available, I can guarantee you from experience, but also from political, emotional intelligence, that the Africans will prefer Europe to China.
Let that sink in. So just talking still about China, we've just had the Belt and Road Initiative Forum in China. Many African leaders were here. And then just a few days later, the European Union had its Global Gateway Forum, which is also about connectivity. And I was just wondering, from your point of view, Professor Lopes, these two initiatives, BRI, Global Gateway, there are others. The G7 has an initiative. The Turks have an initiative. The Americans have an initiative. Why all this competition? Isn't it sort of worthwhile to put our money together, our ideas together, talk to the Africans, and then work with Africa to boost connectivity across the continent?
Africa is seen as the terrain for occupying market share. And market share can be seen from an economic viewpoint, but also from a political viewpoint. It's a political market share. And therefore, everybody has an initiative for Africa. In fact, the most significant ones are an attempt at responding of the Belt and Road Initiative. And they don't make any bones about it. They say it's about responding to China. So that, as I read in the China Daily this week, is a proof that the Belt and Road Initiative is the marker, is the reference, which the Chinese laugh because, they criticize it, but they are trying to do the same. But, if you look into the Global Gateway, basically it's a market packaging of existing aid. It's nothing new. So there is no additionality there. With the Belt and Road Initiative, there was additionality. And we have to put it in the past. There was. Right now, there isn't. Because the Chinese are slowing down quite significantly for reasons that have to do with their domestic problems. But the Global Gateway is just a packaging of existing aid with one particular dimension that neither the Europeans or the Africans saw coming, is that this was announced at the Africa-Europe Summit just weeks before the invasion of Ukraine. And then, since then, all this money that has been promised, even the recurrent one, the one that was already engaged and very much part of the pattern, is compromised. There's less. So we can have as many meetings as we want, but you go one by one. Let's take peace and security. There was an Africa peace and security architecture that was supported by the European Union. That support has been reduced dramatically because now there is no more a bilateral agreement between the African Union and the European Union for APSA, for the Africa Peace and Security Architecture. There is just a unilateral European decision that is part of the European security strategy that, sort of lends support for different initiatives depending on European priorities. And of course, where are the European priorities right now? The money has gone for Ukraine. So that's why we're going to have huge problems in the Sahel, huge problems in Somalia, and so on and so forth.
Right. Professor, thank you for that. So we're just moving on because it's a fascinating conversation and we need to talk about two more things. One is about international finance and representation. And I know that you've been very active on that front. And you've said that you need a transformed financial system so that Africa has a stronger voice, more votes in the IMF and the World Bank. And of course, the AU, the African Union, has also recently become a member of the G20. So are we seeing finally, an increased representation for Africa on the geopolitical and the geoeconomic landscape?
I think there is a realization that Africa is becoming more and more politically important as a continental unit. And this discussion, for instance, of the G20, I first proposed Africa become integrated in the G20 in 2011. So it takes a long time for things to finally land. But I like to say that some of these big gatherings, it's as important to gain a debate as to gain a negotiation. Because when you gain a debate, it means that narrative and that request or that concept has legs. It's not going to go away, and eventually it will happen. And I think it's exactly the situation where we are right now with representation in the international financial institutions. I think the Africans have already gained the debate, but now it's going to take time until finally it happens. Definitely there is a realization that you cannot ignore a continent that is going to have 1/3 of the population by the end of the century.
Thank you very much, Professor. And moving on now to COP28, meeting in United Arab Emirates very shortly. And the question of climate financing, especially for African countries, is very dear to your heart. And I was wondering, progress so far, very patchy, completely insufficient, or has there been progress?
I think we are on climate finance, and this is very controversial. I get a lot of pushback when I say this amongst even friends. I think we are at the end of the concessional centrality in climate finance. It translated into, sort of normal understanding. It's not aid money for climate that is going to make things happen. We have an urgency. We have basically a discussion about pledges and commitments that has gone for 14 years. We basically can't meet those commitments. And even when they are announced, you look into the OECD data on official development assistance, and because all climate finance is also ODA, and you see that there is no progress. So it's just double counting when it's announced. So why are we insisting over and over in new commitments? This year it will be the loss and damage fund, another fund. And another commitments will be made. And it will always be a double counting. And it is always the same development money. So I think because of that, we have to shift the discussion in two directions. First, we have to admit that there is no such a thing as a discussion on climate and a discussion on development. All development as of now, maybe it was not the case before, is also about climate. You cannot really develop with, sort of the carbon approach of the past. Mm-hmm. So it's about climate. And all discussions about climate have to be just. So it's about development. So if we accept that, then we kind of minimize all this pledging and centrality of concessionality. which brings me to the second point, which is about we cannot continue to just talk about de-risking when it is friendly to nature. Anything that is friendly to nature, we say, oh, there is a need for de-risking, meaning we need some concessional lending or public money to entice the private sector to do the right thing. We are touching the end of that. Volunteering to deal with the climate is not going to work. It hasn't worked in the last few years. We are in a trajectory to aggravate the situation even further. And the extreme way of telling us there is no such a thing as time to think. We have to act now. And to act now, basically, it's about entering into regulatory systems, which we have been trying to avoid. But it's absolutely indispensable. So my contribution has been to entice leaders, but particularly the Africans, about a series of proposals that are going to create the regulatory dimensions that will incentivize moving into climate action. Otherwise, we are going to continue this discussion about climate finance as if it was more aid or less aid.
Can you give one example of this regulatory direction that would help get the money?
Yes, the Africans in the Africa Climate Summit, and I was part of that process, proposed tax the shipping industry, tax the aviation industry, tax the international financial transactions, and relate them to climate.
And how did that go down?
Well, the Africans are very much keen on it. Sometimes you, as I said, you gain a debate rather than the negotiation. This time we have not yet gained the debate. So it's still a work in progress.
You planted the ideas, you planted the seeds, which is something that you do very, very well, Professor Lopes, and have been doing for many, many years now. I know from experience. Professor Lopes, a final question for you. Countries in the global south often complain about European double standards, geopolitical, geoeconomic, also evident during the vaccine pandemic. And I was just wondering what your ideas are about this.
Africans were quite shocked during the pandemic when a lot of the promises that were made were the subject of double standards, the way the vaccines and the respiratory equipment, etc. All this fight pushing countries out that were most vulnerable, the lack of solidarity, all sort of promises that were translated into actions that were, basically hypocritical. So that was a shock. Then came the war in Ukraine. And again, the Europeans, wanted to make it a world problem. And of course, the Africans were a bit more skeptical because they're saying, wait a minute, we have something similar happening here and there. For instance, why don't we talk as much about what is happening in Sudan and so on? So there were lots of concerns about these double standards that were already motivated by this attitude during the pandemic. So it was like a continuation. Then came the issue of the grains. And again, the Europeans were basically, pushing the Africans out of the markets for some of the grains resulting from the scarcity of the provoked by the war. Then the Ukraine also had an impact on the discussion about gas and indirectly other fossil fuels, which was, Africa should not invest on gas, should not go for gas, but all of a sudden it was okay to do it again, but to export to Europe. And I think, this succession of events in just a few years is now, corroborated with what is happening in Israel-Palestine conflict and in Gaza in particular. And the Africans are just seeing yet again the double standards on the part of the Europeans. And in this case, the Europeans also have been divided amongst themselves in terms of the reactions in relation to what were principles espoused for Ukraine that now don't see the light of the day for Gaza. So it is a shock. And it is a shock that is contributing to an erosion of the European image big time. And I think, the Europeans will pay a price for these contradictions in terms of legitimacy. And, they will not be believed when they say certain things the same way they are not believed when they commit for climate finance.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for this. It's been a I don't know how to say this to you, a disheartening conversation for me, because it sort of confirms all my concerns about how we're dealing with the global South and with Africa, more particularly, how often and how long I've worked on these issues. And I've never seen us in such a bad state, in such a poor state.
It's a very crucial moment because, I read something written by Jean-Marie Guéhenno. He used to be under Secretary General for for peacekeeping operations, and a very savvy French expert on the matter. He's now a professor at the Columbia University in New York. And his analysis that I respect was basically the point I was making. He's saying we are going to pay such a huge price in Europe for these double standards that are so obvious. And people are not going to take it lightly. And it's going to have a lingering effect.
Thank you so much again, Professor Lopes.
Thank you, Shada. Yeah. All the best.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the MENA Talks. Share your thoughts with us on social media with the hashtag MENA Talks and follow us to receive our latest news and updates. The MENA Talks is a podcast series on the Middle East and Africa, an initiative of the Brussels International Centre.